"You can't bring goats into a gated community, you lunatic," Karen screamed, holding her clipboard like a sword, face flushed and nostrils flaring as she tried to block the path of my truck with her body. I leaned out the window, raised an eyebrow, and calmly replied, "Ma'am, you're standing in the middle of a county road." She pointed dramatically at the 2 goats in the trailer behind me, yelling, "I'm calling the police. You're farming illegally, and you're not even registered with our HOA." I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Because the moment she dialed 911 and started ranting about an unhinged farmer running a bootleg operation in her neighborhood, she had no clue she was calling the one man she'd regret ever messing with, me, the county sheriff. I had moved into the old parcel of land my grandfather left me just outside of Pine Ridge proper. The 5 acres were a bit wild, a bit unkempt, but deeply loved. I'd spent my weekends restoring the barn, adding a few raised beds, and bringing in some chickens and goats to kickstart my small homestead. The property, technically outside the HOA boundary, still happened to border their meticulously trimmed suburban bubble. That didn't stop Karen from pretending I was a personal threat to her turf. It started small. Snide looks when I drove past, emails to the county about my unsightly wooden fence, and even a bizarre note left in my mailbox that said, "HOAs protect property values. Stop being the exception." Signed, a concerned neighbor. I ignored her mostly. I had dealt with louder and dumber during my time in uniform. Karen was noise, not fire. Until the day she trespassed. I had just finished feeding the goats and was rinsing out their water tubs when I heard the creak of my gate and the unmistakable click-clack of high heels on gravel. Karen stormed onto my land like she was leading a military raid, phone in one hand, shouting, "This is all illegal. This is agricultural fraud. There are zoning violations, environmental hazards, and possibly goat rabies involved." I stood there, soaked from the hose, watching her trip over a stray feed bucket and nearly land face first into the hay. She caught herself, then pointed at me like I was a criminal mastermind. She filmed everything, narrating it like a crime documentary. Here we have an unsanctioned farming setup, possibly unlicensed animals. The smell alone is disrupting community harmony. I told her once again that she was trespassing. She replied with, "You don't get to talk law with me. I'm on the HOA enforcement board." That's when she made her final mistake of the day, threatening to call the cops and shut my entire property down. I tilted my head and simply said, "Go ahead." 10 minutes later, a county deputy rolled up. Young guy, fresh out of training, who hadn't met me yet in my civilian clothes. He saw me in my muddy boots and work shirt and immediately turned to Karen, nodding like she was some beacon of justice. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue?" She went on a long, dramatic rant about code violations, goat odor, and imaginary zoning infractions. He turned to me, asking for my ID. I didn't argue. I walked him to the barn. "Let me show you something," I said. Inside, under an old canvas sheet, was my marked patrol vehicle. Next to it, framed on the wall, was my active sheriff's badge and a plaque signed by the mayor himself. I watched the deputy's face pale as it all clicked together. Karen peeked in behind us, phone still filming, and nearly dropped it when she saw the badge. "Wait, you're the sheriff?" she gasped. I nodded slowly. "County Sheriff Jack Morgan. Nice to meet you again, ma'am. You just filed a false report, trespassed on county land, and possibly endangered livestock by barging through an unlocked gate. But hey, I'm off duty today." Karen sputtered something about being misinformed and tried to backpedal. The deputy gave her a look that said he regretted ever stopping here. I let it go for the moment. She scurried off the property like a cat soaked with a hose, her bravado in tatters. The deputy apologized and made a mental note never to trust suburban busybodies again. I could have pressed charges then and there, but something told me Karen wasn't done. The next day, I found a stack of papers crammed into my mailbox. Violation notices, all fake, all printed on HOA letterhead. One accused me of operating a commercial goat breeding facility. Another said my sunflowers posed a pollen hazard. A third said I was harboring rooster weapons, whatever that meant. Karen wasn't just annoyed. She had declared war. And that, in hindsight, was the funniest part, because she still didn't understand the rules of the game she'd started. She thought she was dealing with some hillbilly farmer with a truck and a couple of goats. But what she was about to learn, slowly and painfully, is that I don't just enforce the law. I am the law. I didn't retaliate right away. I let her dig herself in deeper. I attended town meetings in uniform, watched her shift uncomfortably in her seat, eyes darting away from me. I noticed her making phone calls in the parking lot, clutching her files like state secrets. I caught wind that she was planning to bring the full HOA board to my property with evidence of agricultural misconduct. I almost laughed when I heard that. Karen didn't know about the zoning records I had stored in my office, or the agricultural easement that my land had been granted back in the 80s, or the fact that, under county law, her HOA had absolutely no authority over me. But I stayed patient, because timing is everything. And Karen was about to give me all the ammo I'd need. I had no doubt she'd do something dumb. The kind of dumb you can't talk your way out of. And when she did, I'd be there. Not just as the guy with goats and tomatoes, but as the one person who could shut down her little neighborhood kingdom for good. She just didn't know it yet. The following week began with a thud against my front gate, a delivery man dropping off yet another envelope from the HOA. It was wrapped in one of those official-looking plastic sleeves, like it contained a court summons or a medical report. I opened it slowly, already knowing it was from Karen, and sure enough, it was a new list of citations. This time, she claimed I was creating public disturbance through agricultural odors, accused me of running an unlicensed food production site, and even wrote something about my goats causing noise pollution at inappropriate hours. I laughed under my breath. The goats didn't even start bleeding until 7:00 a.m., and most of the time, they were quieter than the landscaper she hired every Thursday morning to trim 2 inches off her already manicured lawn. But this wasn't about noise or smell. This was about control. Karen had decided I was a threat to her perfect suburban fantasy. And she was going to keep pushing until something gave way. She didn't stop there. She began organizing what she called community safety meetings in her backyard every Sunday evening. Neighbors showed up, not really understanding what they were being roped into. Karen had printed flyers with phrases like "protect our property values" and "stop unauthorized land use," pairing photos of my chicken coop with dramatic red circles like it was a true crime investigation. At first, a few people nodded along, confused but polite, but as the weeks passed, I noticed more of them turning away during the speeches, some rolling their eyes, others outright leaving early. Still, Karen marched forward like a general in a battle no one else had signed up for. Meanwhile, I documented everything. I kept the fake notices, took pictures of the flyers, and even installed a few motion-triggered cameras around the perimeter of my land, just in case she decided to trespass again. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, and I had a feeling I'd need it soon. One morning, just before sunrise, I noticed a car parked half a block down the road. Lights off, with someone inside. I put on my sheriff's badge, walked over casually, and tapped on the window. The driver, a junior member of the HOA board named Dennis, nearly jumped out of his seat. I asked what he was doing there. He stuttered something about collecting data for community assessment. I told him next time he wanted to assess anything near my property, he should schedule it during business hours and make sure his clipboard wasn't filled with handwritten notes about chicken escape routes. Karen's next move came the following week, and it was a bold one. She filed an official HOA violation with a fine of $10,000, citing illegal development of the property and endangerment of neighboring homes due to unregulated farm structures. The document was hilariously vague and clearly not based on any real ordinance, but it was sent to the county, and unfortunately, protocol requires someone to follow up. So the next day, a zoning inspector named Barry showed up, clipboard in hand, clearly annoyed that his morning had been wasted on this nonsense. Barry was an old friend of mine from high school, now working civil enforcement. He took one look at the property, one look at me, and sighed. We walked the land together, and I handed him the zoning maps I had pulled from the archives. The maps showed something Karen had no idea about. Decades ago, My grandfather had worked with the county to designate our land as an agricultural demonstration site, meaning it had special protections under local law. Not only was I allowed to have animals, coops, greenhouses, and roadside stands, I could technically invite school tours, sell produce directly on site, and even host small farming workshops without needing HOA approval. Barry chuckled when he saw the documents. He said Karen was going to hate this. I said she'd earned it, but Karen didn't back off. Instead, she escalated. She started spreading rumors online, anonymous posts on neighborhood forums accusing me of hoarding dangerous chemicals, of letting animals roam loose at night, even suggesting I had a connection to a black market egg ring. Yes, really. I only found out when one of the neighbors, an older man named Walter who had lived on the block for 30 years, came by holding a printed post with a confused look on his face. He asked me if it was true that I had weaponized roosters. I nearly choked on my coffee. We both laughed for 5 straight minutes, and then Walter handed me a slice of lemon pie his wife had baked and told me to keep doing what you're doing. That was when I realized not everyone was on Karen's side. She was loud, yes, but she wasn't winning hearts. In fact, the more noise she made, the more support I started getting. A few neighbors dropped off thank you cards, saying they loved seeing the chickens in the morning. Someone sent me a handmade sign that read, "Fresh eggs are not a crime." The woman next door, who'd been neutral until now, brought over a basket of vegetables and asked if I'd help her start a small garden of her own. Karen must have noticed all of this because the next morning I found a dead zucchini smashed on my driveway and a note that said, "This isn't over." It was almost cartoonish at this point. I returned to the sheriff's office the following Monday and quietly opened a new file, documenting the harassment, the trespassing, the fake reports, and the coordinated HOA efforts to harass a legal property owner. I wasn't ready to press charges yet, but I wanted it all on the record. The wheels were turning. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was building her own case. Every lie, every phony complaint, every bit of slander. She was helping me build a rock-solid foundation for the kind of counteraction that didn't just settle disputes. It taught lessons. By the end of the month, Karen had made one final push. She filed for a community vote to pass an emergency motion that would allow the HOA to fine properties outside their zone if they were impacting neighborhood quality. It was ridiculous and non-enforceable, but the vote was set. She rallied hard. Flyers, door knocks, scare tactics. She told neighbors that my goats could attract coyotes, that my compost bins would explode with bacteria, that I had plans to install a pigsty next to the playground. But she underestimated just how tired everyone was of her. The night of the vote, barely 10 people showed up. Of those 10, 8 voted against her. The motion failed, and Karen left the meeting in a silent fury, gripping her binder like a weapon, eyes full of rage and confusion. She didn't know it, but she just crossed the final line, and I had everything I needed to respond. Not with goats, not with more words, but with the kind of justice only someone in my position could deliver. It wasn't revenge. It was civic education, and class was about to begin. It started innocently enough. Just a simple roadside table under the shade of an oak tree. I propped up a couple of wooden crates, laid out a few dozen eggs, fresh tomatoes, and hand-labeled jars of blackberry jam. I hung a small chalkboard sign that read, "Sheriff's Farm Fresh." It wasn't some elaborate commercial setup, just a nod to the community, a little local flavor. Most folks driving by slowed down, smiled, and honked supportively. A few neighbors even stopped to chat and bought a couple things. The vibe was easy, peaceful, the way country life should feel. But peace and simplicity were things Karen couldn't stand. The following morning, I stepped out to find the stand still intact. But my chalkboard sign had been knocked over, and the jam jars had been opened and spilled. The eggs were smashed in their cartons, like someone had thrown a tantrum in the night. A single note had been wedged under a brick that held the corner of the table down. It said, "Ceased illegal sales activity immediately, or further action will be taken." No signature, but the passive-aggressive cursive was unmistakably Karen's. I cleaned up the mess, replaced what I could, and set the stand up again. I wasn't going to back down. Not when I was completely within my rights. By midday, A small crowd had gathered. A group of kids from the neighborhood came by with their parents and asked if they could see the chickens. I gave them a little tour and handed out a few eggs as a gift. Smiles all around. People took photos. The atmosphere was wholesome, even joyful. And then, right in the middle of it all, a familiar shriek cut through the breeze. Karen came storming down the street like a windswept banshee. Phone already recording, lips curled into an indignant snarl. "This is an unauthorized business operation on private land," she barked, aiming the phone at the eggs like they were evidence of some felony. "You can't sell food to the public without inspection certificates and permits. This is endangering the neighborhood." I calmly reminded her, in front of a dozen witnesses, that not only was the land zoned for agricultural activity, but I also held a current county-issued food handler's permit. I even had the laminated copy in my truck. Karen was momentarily thrown off, but she recovered quickly and pulled out a small laminated card of her own, an HOA rulebook. She pointed to a paragraph that mentioned no commercial activity on HOA-adjacent properties that affects community aesthetic. I smiled. Then I stepped aside and motioned to the sheriff's badge on my belt. Karen's phone slowly lowered as realization crept into her face. A few of the parents started whispering. One of them began filming. Karen tried to pivot, claiming she'd already called the police and filed a formal complaint. "Perfect," I said. "Let's wait for them together." Not 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. A deputy stepped out, confused at first, then grinned when he saw me. He walked over, gave me a respectful nod, and asked what the issue was. I let Karen speak first. She ranted about health codes, zoning violations, endangerment, and the psychological trauma of seeing goat droppings on a nearby walking trail. The deputy nodded along professionally, stone-faced, then turned to me and said, "You good, Sheriff?" I nodded. He looked back at Karen and said, "There's no violation here, ma'am. He's completely within his rights." Karen's mouth hung open. She looked between the deputy and me, trying to find some loophole, some technicality. There wasn't one. Later that evening, a neighbor posted the video online. It went viral in local circles. Karen shrieking, accusing me of running a black market egg syndicate, and me standing calmly while children petted goats and laughed in the background. The post was captioned, "When Eloy Drama Meets the Sheriff." The comments were brutal. Some people accused Karen of power tripping. Others called her the goat whisperer of doom. A few even offered to come by jam just to spite her. The response embarrassed her, and it only fueled her next move. 2 days later, the HOA board released a carefully worded email to the entire community, stating that while they value neighborhood harmony, the actions of one farm bordering the HOA have created visual disruption and agricultural intrusion. It was clearly Karen's doing, but they didn't have the spine to name me directly. So I responded the way any county officer would. I submitted an official letter to the board, citing the agricultural easement again, along with photographs of their flyers, false citations, and reports of Karen's trespassing. I CC'd the county clerk, the zoning department, and the sheriff's internal legal counsel. That got their attention. One of the board members, a woman named Gloria, reached out privately. She confessed that she was tired of Karen's theatrics and apologized for the escalating tension. She even offered to mediate a meeting, but I declined. This wasn't a personal issue. It was a pattern of harassment backed by a false belief in unchecked authority. Karen wasn't going to stop because she didn't think anyone could stop her. She believed HOA power overrode the law, that enough noise would drown out truth. But she'd made one crucial mistake from the beginning. She picked a fight with someone who not only knew the rules, but helped write them. A week passed with no more incidents, and I let myself believe maybe the worst had passed. That illusion broke on a foggy Tuesday morning when I received an official summons to appear in small claims court. Karen had filed a restraining order request against me, claiming I had threatened her, followed her in my patrol car, and used farm animals to intimidate her. The packet was thick, filled with grainy screenshots, anonymous statements, and a printout of a rooster meme someone had tagged me in online. I couldn't stop laughing, but the accusation was serious enough that I had to show up and defend myself. I spent the next few days gathering everything: video footage, dates, witness statements, the permit history, and of course, Karen's long and winding list of fake violations and bizarre social media posts. By the time I walked into the courtroom, I had 3 neatly organized folders and a calm, quiet confidence. Karen was already seated, flanked by a lawyer and a pile of color-coded binders. She didn't look at me. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her lips were pursed in that tight smile she wore when she thought she had the upper hand. The judge, an older woman with little patience for nonsense, asked Karen to present her case first. What followed was a bizarre theatrical monologue that made the entire room feel like a community theater production. Karen spoke of fear, intimidation, dangerous livestock, weaponized compost piles, and spiritual harm. When it was my turn, I didn't say much. I let the paperwork speak. I handed over records, maps, permits, a letter from the county zoning office, and a USB drive containing footage of Karen walking onto my property multiple times, uninvited. When I was finished, the judge didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned to Karen and asked if she had any legal evidence to support her claims. Karen stammered, tried to backtrack, and finally muttered something about community wellness. The judge sighed. She ruled against her. Not only was the restraining order denied, but Karen was fined for filing a frivolous complaint in order to pay court costs. As I walked out of the courtroom, I didn't smile or gloat. I just tipped my hat, nodded to the judge, and left with my head high. By the time the court ruling was shared in the HOA newsletter, the neighborhood had already picked its side, and it wasn't Karen's. The board, having no choice but to acknowledge the decision, issued a short and awkward statement about respecting legal processes and avoiding personal grievances. It was damage control, nothing more. But the real shift wasn't in the email or the newsletter. It was in the quiet way people started crossing the street when Karen walked by, or how chairs subtly moved away from her during the next community meeting. She still held her clipboard like it meant something, but the power behind it had vanished. The week after court, I found myself hosting a group of kids from a local elementary school for a small farm tour. It was something my grandfather used to do when I was young, and now I felt like I was stepping into his shoes, showing them how chickens are raised, how vegetables grow, how bees pollinate the squash blossoms. They asked curious questions, laughed when a goat sneezed mid-lick, and left with little cartons of eggs. Their teacher thanked me, and one of the parents said it was the first time her daughter had ever picked a tomato. It reminded me why I started the farm in the first place, why I put up with all the nonsense. It wasn't about Karen. It was about community. Real community, not whatever fantasy version she was trying to impose. But Karen, of course, couldn't let it go. Days after the tour, she submitted a complaint to the Department of Health, claiming I was running an unauthorized petting zoo and endangering children. I received a formal notice in the mail. This time, though, it backfired almost instantly. The inspector who arrived wasn't just thorough. He was friendly. A man named Ernesto, born and raised in the county, who used to ride in my patrol car during ride-alongs when he was a teenager. He walked the property, took notes, asked a few procedural questions, and even bought a jar of jam. He told me it was one of the cleanest small farms he'd ever inspected and said he'd be recommending me for a county showcase on sustainable micro-farming. When the HOA board caught wind of that, things got even worse for Karen. One of the board members, a soft-spoken man named Jeff, who rarely said anything, stood up during the next meeting and asked if the board should vote on whether Karen's ongoing complaints were damaging the HOA's reputation. Karen went pale. She tried to argue that she was the only one protecting the integrity of the neighborhood, but the room was silent. No one nodded. No one backed her. Her authority had officially collapsed. The very next day, I received a letter delivered by hand from the HOA board. It stated that while I was not under their jurisdiction, they wanted to offer an apology for the undue stress caused by one of their members and extended an invitation to speak at their annual community gathering. I chuckled reading it. It was ironic. After months of harassment, fabricated fines, trespassing, and false police calls, I was now the guest of honor, but I had something better in mind. I thanked them politely and instead told them I would be hosting my own event, the county's first annual Harvest and Heroes Day, held right here on my farm. Open to the public, open to the neighborhood. No clipboard needed. I sent invitations to every household in the area, personally delivering them with a smile. I even dropped one in Karen's mailbox just for the poetic sting of it. She responded exactly how I expected, with fury. She immediately tried to schedule a competing event, branding it the HOA Autumn Appreciation Picnic, but the timing was bad and the optics were worse. She sent out flyers that read, "Don't be misled by off-property distractions. Community values matter." But the tone was sour and desperate, and when my flyers went up at the local diner, coffee shop, and fire station, it became clear which event people were interested in. The day of the event arrived with clear skies and crisp air. People showed up in waves. Families with kids, retirees, teenagers looking for something to do. Even a local band who asked if they could play a few songs near the hay bales. We had everything: pumpkin carving, goat petting, apple cider, and a few booths set up by local farms and artisans. The highlight of the day was a pie contest, judged by none other than the county commissioner and my former academy instructor. Somewhere around noon, while I was helping a group of kids feed corn to the chickens, I spotted her, Karen, standing just outside the edge of my property, arms folded, sunglasses on, lips pursed so tight they looked like they might snap shut permanently. She didn't step onto the land, couldn't. The court order still stood, but she watched everything, jaw tight, nostrils flaring each time someone laughed or thanked me. The final blow came unexpectedly as the crowd gathered near the makeshift stage. The county commissioner took the mic and announced that due to the outstanding community engagement and legal clarity demonstrated by this property, the county was recognizing it as a model for future community agriculture partnership. He then handed me a framed certificate. The crowd applauded. I looked up briefly and saw Karen's silhouette disappear behind a bush as she turned and walked away. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the sky turned gold, I sat on the back porch, sipping cider and watching the goats settle into their pen. The land was quiet again. Not silent, but peaceful. The good kind of quiet, the kind that isn't disturbed by shrieking complaints or slanderous flyers, just the occasional chirp of a cricket and the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. The victory wasn't in the certificate or the applause. It wasn't in beating Karen in court or humiliating her in front of the neighborhood. It was in watching people laugh, learn, and connect on this land, and seeing kids discover where their food came from, and hearing neighbors talk to each other again instead of arguing in Facebook groups. Karen tried to tear something down, but she ended up building something stronger without even realizing it. She brought people to my doorstep. She made the community care. And now, finally, her noise had faded. The legal battles were over. The goats were still here. So was I. The clipboard had lost its power. The farm stood tall, and justice had done what it always does. Eventually, it restored balance. Autumn deepened into late October, and with it came a calm that hadn't existed in the neighborhood for months. The air had changed, crisp and cool, scented faintly with wood smoke and hay. The trees around the property had turned fiery shades of orange and red, and the goats had grown thick, shaggy coats. Morning fog would roll in like something out of a storybook, blanketing the grass in dew, and through it all, there was silence from Karen's side of the fence. No citations, no rants, no surprise inspections, just the dull, hollow echo of her defeat lingering in the background like a distant thunder that had passed. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to go quietly. Even in silence, she was brewing something. She had retreated into herself, yes, but not surrendered. It was the kind of silence that meant plotting, not peace. Then one morning, I found a new development. A few surveyor flags lined the edge of the property between my land and Karen's backyard. I recognized the colors immediately. Orange for property line disputes, yellow for utilities. Someone was planning something. I walked over to the county office later that day, and the clerk, who I'd known for years, confirmed it. Karen had filed a request to challenge the boundary line. She claimed part of my fencing and animal enclosure was built on shared land, and that I was encroaching on her property. Her claim was based on an old map from the 1970s, long outdated and superseded by newer zoning adjustments. But technically, she had the right to initiate a review. I didn't panic. I'd dealt with worse, but I did smile, because if Karen wanted to play legal chess again, she hadn't learned her lesson the first time. I pulled out my own copy of the updated survey, one filed in 1999 and reaffirmed in 2010. Not only did it confirm my boundary down to the inch, but it also included the legal documentation showing that the disputed strip was a county utility easement and not under HOA or private ownership. I made a few calls, and then I made a quiet purchase. The lot adjacent to Karen's property had sat empty for years, owned by a man who moved out of state and had no plans to return. The sale went through within 2 weeks. Karen didn't even know until she saw the sign go up. I posted it myself, right along the fence line facing her house. County Sheriff Community Garden and Rescue Co-op. A small project dedicated to rehabilitating neglected or surrendered roosters, abandoned hens, and teaching youth agricultural programs. It was real. I meant every word, but it also served a purpose. I had chickens, yes, but now I had roosters. Roosters who greeted the morning with powerful, piercing crows at dawn. Every single day, without fail, just as the sun rose behind the hills, their calls rang out like bugles from across the field. Karen lost it within the first 48 hours. I saw her storm outside in a bathrobe, waving a broom at the fence line, yelling at nothing in particular. She called animal control. They came. They left without issue. She filed a noise complaint. The officer who responded was one of my former deputies. He offered her a brochure on soundproof windows. By the end of the week, she had emailed the HOA board 6 separate times, demanding an emergency meeting. None of them responded. Meanwhile, my community program flourished. Local high schoolers came by on weekends to help care for the animals. A small composting workshop drew in families from outside the HOA, people who had never even known my little farm existed. One woman brought her elderly father, who used to run a dairy farm, and he spent an entire afternoon just sitting by the goats, smiling like he traveled back in time. It was more than just about Karen now. It had grown into something real, something rooted. I never rubbed any of it in her face. I never spoke her name or mocked her publicly. I didn't need to. Her isolation was punishment enough. She walked alone now. The whispers followed her. The parents who used to smile at her meetings crossed the street instead. Her own HOA board had quietly stripped her of enforcement privileges, citing excessive misuse of process as the cause. She was still there. Yes, still in her home. Still clutching that clipboard like it had power. But she no longer had an audience. Just empty chairs and quiet fences. Then something unexpected happened. One chilly morning, as I walked toward the coop with a bucket of feed, I spotted her near the fence, not yelling, not sneering, just standing there, arms crossed, eyes cast down. I approached slowly. She looked up. For the first time in months, she didn't have that steel wall of entitlement on her face. She looked tired, smaller somehow, older. She didn't say anything right away, and I didn't either. The roosters crowed behind me. A goat let out a lazy bleat. Then Karen finally spoke, her voice low, almost lost in the breeze. "I didn't expect it to go like this," she said. "I just wanted things to stay the way they were." I nodded. Change is hard, but it's part of living. She looked around, as if really seeing the land for the first time. The chickens dust bathing near the shed. The kids' art projects displayed on the barn wall. The hand-painted signs welcoming people in. "This was never about code violations, was it?" she asked. I said nothing, just waited. She gave a weak laugh and said she had been the president of the HOA board for 7 years, kept everything pristine, perfect lawns, quiet streets, nothing out of line. And then one day, I woke up and realized the neighborhood had grown cold. Everyone behind gates and hedges, everyone afraid to be different. "Maybe I went too far," she whispered. I didn't forgive her, not in that moment. Some things take time, but I offered a slow nod, and for the first time, we stood there without conflict buzzing in the air between us. She walked away a few moments later, slower than she'd arrived. I didn't see her for weeks after that. Maybe she was finally tired of the fight. Or maybe she realized the world wasn't hers to control. That winter, we put up lights along the barn and opened up the garden for a holiday event. We served cider, hot stew, let kids decorate the coop with handmade ornaments. One of the volunteers asked if they could name one of the roosters after someone from the neighborhood. I smiled and said, "Sure, name it whatever you like." They named him Karen. He crows the loudest.